Welcome to this explainer. If you've ever stared at your college transcript and just kind of wondered how that specific random mix of credits, hours, and grades actually proves your worth to the rest of the world, well, you are in the exact right place. We almost never stop to think about the invisible machinery operating behind our diplomas, right? But today, we are officially decoding the historical and economic forces that completely shaped the global university. So, what exactly is a university? It sounds like a super simple question on the surface, but it actually challenges our most basic assumptions about higher education. Is a university this isolated, peaceful sanctuary for the pure pursuit of truth, totally detached from the messy realities of the outside world? Or is it an economic engine, explicitly designed to pump out highly skilled workers for a hyper-competitive global knowledge economy? Well, the answer to that isn't static. It has radically transformed over the last 2 centuries, and it's reshaped the lives of millions of students in the process. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the original idea, look at the modern scaling problem, and then explore the massive harmonization project called the Bologna process. After that, we'll break down the mechanics of ECTS, check out the American response, and wrap up with the tensions of tomorrow. Let's dive right in. All right, moving into section 1, the original idea. Let's see how the absolute gold standard of the modern university was actually born in 19th century Prussia. Back in 1810, the University of Berlin, which we now know as Humboldt University, was founded, and it basically set the gold standard for higher education by bringing teaching and research together under one roof for the very first time. But, an academic institution is never truly insulated from the world around it. Fast forward to 1933, and this exact same prestigious institution saw its renowned scholars dismissed and its own books literally burned in its own square by the Nazi regime. Then, by 1948, caught right in the middle of Soviet-controlled East Berlin, academic freedom was so severely suppressed that it sparked a massive split, ultimately creating the Freie Universität in the West. So, as we can clearly see from history, the pursuit of truth is always tethered to the fierce political realities of its time. Just think about this quote from 1826. A student named Ludwig Feuerbach described his university as a temple of work, comparing other schools to, well, basically just public houses. In this original Humboldtian model, learning definitely wasn't some calculated pathway just to land a corporate entry-level job. No, it was an intimate, highly specialized, and deeply rigorous search for pure truth. You had professors and a very small, hand-picked number of students, forming this quiet, dedicated community. They were intentionally shielded from the utilitarian pressures of the economy. It was romantic, it was elite, and it was entirely focused on cultivating the mind. Okay, so let's move on to section 2, the modern scaling problem, and see what happens when that beautiful 19th century ideal slams right into modern economic realities. We are looking at a massive paradigm shift here in how we value human knowledge. Think about your own education for a second. Under the old Humboldtian ideal, your education was judged completely by inputs. Things like the untouchable prestige of your professors and the sheer number of hours you sat in an ivy-covered lecture hall. It was highly decentralized and restricted to a tiny elite. But the modern knowledge economy, it demands something entirely different. Today's model is overwhelmingly output-oriented. Honestly, employers don't just care where you spent 4 years of your life anymore. They want standardized, measurable proof of the actual, tangible skills and competencies you've acquired. And here's why that shift had to happen. Historically, university was an incredibly exclusive privilege. We're talking maybe 4 or 5% of the population, specifically trained for learned professions like law or medicine. But as the middle class expanded and the globalized workforce needed more brain power, participation skyrocketed to over 40%. You simply cannot scale a quiet, intimate temple of knowledge to millions and millions of students. It just doesn't work. The system was fundamentally forced to standardize. It was a massive adapt or die moment for higher education across the globe. So, how do you fix a system bursting at the seams? That brings us to section 3, the Bologna process. Picture this. Before 1999, crossing a border in Europe meant your hard-earned degree might suddenly become totally unrecognized. Every single nation had these deeply entrenched, completely varied systems. Then, the Bologna process changed absolutely everything. 29 European countries got together and signed a historic declaration with one wildly ambitious goal: create a unitary European higher education area by 2010. They standardized the 3-tier structure we all know today, bachelor's, master's, and PhDs, right across the continent. And the craziest part, the whole thing was entirely voluntary. Nations willingly overhauled centuries-old systems because they realized a unified, transparent European model was literally the only way to compete globally for top talent against powerhouses in North America and Asia. But practically speaking, how do you actually measure and transfer learning across totally different cultures and economies? Let's break that down in Section 4, the mechanics of ECTS. To make this massive European harmonization actually work, they needed a universal currency for modern education. Enter ECTS, the European Credit Transfer and Accumulation System. Instead of measuring learning by how famous a university is, ECTS is a purely student-centered system. It completely strips away the romance and builds everything around the measurable, tangible workload required for a student to achieve specific learning outcomes. It creates this highly logical, almost mathematical framework where human effort translates perfectly across borders. And it works in 3 strict steps. First, you assign exactly 60 credits for a full-time academic year. Second, those 60 credits are equated to a very specific workload, usually around 1,500 to 1,800 hours of actual student effort. And that's everything: morning lectures, late-night cramming, writing finals, the whole shebang. Finally, step 3, the outcomes are graded statistically on a scale from A, the top 10% of successful students, down to F for a fail. Suddenly, an hour of intense academic study in Rome mathematically equals an hour of study in Stockholm. It's the brilliant standardized engineering of human knowledge. So what is the US doing while Europe gets entirely on the same page? Let's cross the Atlantic for Section 5, the American response. $21.2 billion. That staggering number represents exactly what international students contributed to the United States economy in 2010 alone. Look, higher education is no longer just about cultural enrichment, right? It is a massive multi-billion-dollar export industry. With domestic budgets at the state level constantly facing severe shortfalls, American universities desperately rely on full-paying international students just to keep the lights on and the research labs funded. So staying globally competitive and ensuring U.S. degrees hold immediate worldwide value is absolutely crucial for their financial survival. But here's the catch. Despite the undisputed prestige of elite American institutions, the U.S. is actually lagging way behind in the broader global race for talent. International students make up only 3.4% of the total student body in the U.S. Compare that to Germany at 9.3%, or Australia, which is sitting at a massive 20.9%. With Europe and Asia aggressively aligning their systems to be highly transparent and easy for students to navigate, that fragmented U.S. market share is under some incredibly intense pressure. And the reason for this? Well, unlike Europe, the U.S. has a highly decentralized education system. There's no single federal agency that can just mandate a top-down national qualifications framework. Because of this deep-rooted culture of institutional autonomy, the U.S. has to take a more piecemeal approach. Instead of a sweeping national overhaul, they use a pick-and-choose strategy. You have private, localized initiatives like the Tuning USA project, testing out shared learning outcomes state by state in places like Indiana and Utah. But at the end of the day, it's still a voluntary patchwork, not a unified national standard. Which brings us to our final stop today, Section 6, Tensions of Tomorrow. Let's look at the ideological tensions these competing systems are bound to face. The United States continues to project this really powerful halo of excellence globally, mostly because it legitimately claims many of the absolute top-ranked schools in the world, your Harvards, your MITs, your Stanfords. But this halo effect actually acts like a massive smokescreen for the broader system. When you look past the Ivy League to the thousands of other colleges spread across America, you find a remarkably varied landscape that totally lacks standardized binding quality parameters. In a world moving rapidly toward highly transparent, globally comparable learning metrics, that deep fragmentation is a major long-term vulnerability for the American market. So, I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder as we balance the beautiful historical idea of a university against the unstoppable machinery of the modern economy. As degrees increasingly become these standardized global currencies, and as education shifts completely toward measurable competence and employability, what happens to that quiet, isolated temple of work that Humboldt envisioned? Can we still successfully cultivate the general powers of the human mind, or have we simply built an incredibly efficient, mathematically precise factory to train a global workforce? Thank you so much for joining us on this explainer.